consciousness is a fundamental component of our individual psyche, shaping how we perceive, interpret, and respond to the world. Unlike rigid personality types, consciousness influences personality through a dynamic interplay of different psychological functions. According to the model developed by John Beebe, if the primary function of consciousness is introverted, the auxiliary function naturally adopts an extroverted attitude, and vice versa. This complementary relationship between primary and auxiliary functions is not coincidental, but a highly adaptive mechanism that protects the psyche from becoming overly one-sided or rigid. It encourages a balance of perspectives and mental processes, allowing for flexibility and growth. This concept of alternating function attitudes, often referred to as the aid function model, emerged not from abstract theorizing alone, but from Beebe's extensive clinical experience. Through over 50 years of psychotherapy practice and meticulous study of dreams, fantasies, and behaviors, both his own and those of his patients, Beebe observed patterns that led him to identify a fourfold shadow structure complementing the conscious functions. These shadow functions tend to be more unconscious, negative, or destructive in nature. While the conscious functions work harmoniously with the ego, the shadow functions often oppose the ego's goals, creating inner conflict and tension. To truly benefit from the theory of psychological types, one must engage directly with these shadow aspects of the psyche as part of self-exploration. Otherwise, type theory risks becoming a superficial labeling system, a way to learn about oneself only by comparing with others, rather than through genuine internal experience and growth. While discovering new psychic energies through this theory is valuable, it should never be mistaken for individuation, which is a deeper, more transformative process of becoming one's true self. Carl Jung himself emphasized that psychological types were tools for organizing empirical material in therapy, rather than rigid classifications of people. Through this lens, therapy helps a patient locate where specific unconscious complexes reside within the psyche. For example, when interpreting a dream figure, understanding its psychological type can reveal symbolic insights about its role in the individual's inner world. In clinical settings, patients may present problems related to any of the four primary functions of consciousness: thinking, feeling, intuition, or sensation. The therapist's role is to help the patient summon and apply the most appropriate function according to the situation, thereby restoring balance and adaptability. Developing consciousness means enhancing the capacity to switch flexibly among these functions and attitudes, rather than being locked into a single mode of experiencing reality. Beebe's major contribution was to extend Jung's original fourfold model into an eightfold one, pairing each function, attitude, with a corresponding archetype. While Jung associated the inferior function with the anima or animus archetype, the unconscious, repressed emotional opposite of the ego, Beebe expanded this by naming and defining archetypes for all 8 function attitudes, thus enriching the model's symbolic depth. To illustrate this, consider Jung's own psychological type: introverted thinking as his dominant function and extroverted intuition as his auxiliary. In Beebe's system, the dominant function is represented by the hero archetype, a symbol of ego strength, mastery, and self-identity formed early in life. The auxiliary function is represented by the father or mother archetype, embodying nurturing, guidance, and protective qualities. The tertiary function, introverted sensation, corresponds to the eternal child archetype, Latin, puer or puella. This archetype symbolizes immaturity, playfulness, creativity, and vulnerability. Though creative and original, This function can also be unstable and less reliable, often requiring support from others. Lastly, the inferior function, extroverted feeling, is linked to the anima or animus archetype, unconscious emotional attitudes that often provoke shame, embarrassment, or denial when not integrated. These four archetypes form the ego-synonic part of consciousness, harmonizing with the ego's aims and constituting what Beebe calls the little self, our everyday conscious experience and personality. This includes the familiar strengths and vulnerabilities that define how we relate to the world and to ourselves. The other four function attitudes belong to the shadow realm, which Beebe terms the ego-dystonic personality. These shadow aspects develop in opposition to the ego and frequently appear disruptive or destructive. Because the shadow functions embody feelings, desires, and impulses judged unacceptable or immoral by the conscious self, they are repressed and operate autonomously beneath awareness. Sometimes the shadow breaks through repression, expressing impulses the ego has rejected, often creating inner turmoil or outward conflict. Shadow functions tend to generate defensive character traits such as paranoia, avoidance, passive aggression, or inappropriate seduction. They manifest as emotional outbursts, compulsive behaviors, and destructive patterns that can feel alien or uncontrollable. Understanding and integrating these shadow aspects is essential for psychological wholeness. Marie-Lise von Franz, a renowned Jungian analyst, noted that the greatest challenge in understanding others is not encountering their opposite psychological type. For example, an introverted feeling type trying to understand an extroverted feeling type, but rather understanding the same function expressed with the opposite attitude within oneself. These opposing personalities remain puzzling and difficult to grasp because they dwell largely in the unconscious. In Beebe's model, this internal antagonism is not between two separate individuals, but between two opposing functions vying for expression within the same person. For Jung, this dynamic explained why people might struggle with inner conflict and contradictory behaviors. Using Jung's type as an example again, the opposing personality challenges the hero archetype, introverted thinking, through introverted intuition, symbolized by the old man archetype. This counters the good parent archetype, represented by extroverted sensation. Similarly, the trickster archetype opposes the eternal child, and the demonic personality contests the anima. The superior, hero, and inferior, anima, functions form a vertical axis known as the spine of personality. This axis represents the core relationship to oneself, defining our deepest strengths and vulnerabilities. True integrity arises not only from embracing our powers, but also from acknowledging and accepting our weaknesses, holding the paradoxical tension between opposites. This paradox, being both strong and weak, is fundamental to authentic self-awareness. The auxiliary and tertiary functions create a horizontal axis, the arms of personality, which governs how we relate to others, how we care for others, and how they care for us. Many people invest heavily in this relational dimension, sometimes prioritizing it over inner self-knowledge. They define their lives largely by their social roles and interactions, often neglecting the question of who they truly are. Understanding these two axes, the vertical spine and horizontal arms, offers a comprehensive framework for the personality's complex dynamics. It shows personality as a living system in constant negotiation between conscious integration and unconscious opposition. In summary, Beebe's eightfold model illuminates the multifaceted nature of consciousness and personality. It highlights how the ego navigates and integrates various function attitudes and Archetypes, balancing conscious and shadow elements. This intricate interplay shapes our journey towards self-awareness, psychological growth, and ultimately, individuation, the process of becoming a whole, unique, building upon the structural overview of consciousness and personality. We now turn to an in-depth examination of the archetypes associated with each function attitude and their psychological roles. These archetypes are not mere metaphors. They represent dynamic personalities or sub-selves within the psyche, each with distinct drives, strengths, vulnerabilities, and shadow aspects. Understanding these archetypal roles deepens our insight into how the psyche organizes itself and how psychological conflicts arise and can be resolved. The hero or heroine archetype, the ego's champion. At the apex of conscious functioning lies the hero archetype, representing the superior function of consciousness. This archetype symbolizes the development of ego identity and self-mastery. Emerging early in childhood, the hero becomes the person's area of competence, pride, and personal strength. It is the face of the self that confronts challenges and embodies autonomy and responsibility. The hero archetype welcomes life's difficulties and takes on the burdens of growth and individuation. It requires a degree of separation from the excessive demands of the superego, the internalized voices of parents, authority figures, or societal expectations. This distancing allows for authentic self-expression and mastery. However, an over-identification with the hero archetype can lead to a superiority complex, where ego inflation blinds the individual to their limitations and vulnerabilities. The role of the psychologist often involves helping clients loosen rigid identification with this godlike archetype, allowing the more human and vulnerable aspects of their personality to emerge. Only then can genuine growth and healing occur, as the person becomes more integrated and less defensive. The father or mother archetype, the nurturing auxiliary. The auxiliary function corresponds with the archetype of the father or mother, which embodies nurturing, guidance, protection, and fostering growth. In male psychology, Beebe emphasizes the importance of this archetype as it relates to the transmission of fatherly energy, love, knowledge, and support from older generations to younger men. The father archetype transcends the literal father figure. It is a body of wisdom and tradition passed down, facilitating initiation into maturity and selfhood. This archetype plays a crucial role in the development of masculinity and identity. The experience of receiving love, guidance, and boundaries from this archetype is essential for psychological health and growth. Men who lack adequate engagement with this archetype may feel a deep hunger for meaningful mentorship and connection to their ancestral lineage. This need is often symbolized by totem poles or other ancestral symbols, representing a vertical chain of transmission. Importantly, the nurturing father or mother is associated with the auxiliary, not dominant, function. This means that as this archetype becomes active, the individual must loosen the tight grip of the hero archetype, transitioning from self-proving mastery to a more supportive, relational stance. The father archetype encourages competence and autonomy in others rather than competition. Confusing the dominant and auxiliary functions or their associated archetypes can lead to misdiagnosis in psychological typing and misunderstanding of one's inner dynamics. The eternal child archetype, the playful and vulnerable tertiary. The tertiary function aligns with the archetype of the eternal child, Latin, puer or puella, characterized by playfulness, creativity, and immaturity. The tertiary function is like the left hand of a right-handed psyche, original and spontaneous, but sometimes unstable and less reliable. The eternal child archetype embodies a paradox. On one hand, it carries the energy, beauty, and creative potential of childhood, infusing adult life with a sense of wonder and life affirmation. As noted by Jungian analyst Edward Edinger, this archetype utters a sacred yes to life, representing the joy and freedom of play. On the other hand, the eternal child often manifests as false individualism, a defensive stance that sees itself as special and refuses to adapt to reality. This attitude breeds arrogance, fragile self-esteem, and neurosis. People dominated by this archetype may struggle to find fulfilling jobs or relationships, as their ideals are too distant from reality and they avoid real commitment. This archetype can be associated with a provisional life, a sense of being in limbo, or not fully participating in reality. The challenge is to integrate the creativity and vitality of this archetype without succumbing to its escapism and detachment. The anima or animus archetype, the gateway to the unconscious. The inferior function is linked to the anima in men or animus in women, archetypes representing the unconscious, emotional, and opposite-gendered aspects of the psyche. For most people, this archetype is a source of shame, embarrassment, or fear, because it confronts us with parts of ourselves we find unacceptable or confusing. Acceptance and acknowledgement of the anima and animus are critical first steps towards self-knowledge, integrity, and connection to the unconscious. Without this acceptance, the anima remains like a flower that never blooms, its potential for life, creativity, and emotional depth unrealized. The anima acts as a mediator between the conscious ego and the deeper unconscious self. It is deeply tied to idealism and relational values. For example, an introverted thinking type may highly value group harmony, despite lacking emotional skills to create it, while an introverted feeling type may champion complex philosophies, even if struggling with rational understanding. Jung recommended becoming well acquainted with one's anima or animus, especially in the second half of life, to address symptoms such as mood swings, resentments, obsessive attachments, and uncontrolled emotional outbursts. These symptoms indicate maladaptation to the inner world. When the anima is ignored, it often sends symptoms that force recognition, ranging from dread and depression to obsession and dissociation. Embracing the anima as a bridge to the unconscious enables the ego to develop a more authentic and balanced relationship with itself. Clinical example: Beebe's dream of the Chinese laundress. Beebe's clinical insights are exemplified by his own dream of a glum Chinese laundress sitting alone in an empty room, abandoned by a husband who squandered money on gambling and drugs. The laundress embodied introverted sensation, practicality, and focus on tangible matters, while the husband symbolized an ungrounded, extroverted intuition, chasing endless possibilities. This dream highlighted a lack of balance between Beebe's own functions. His introverted sensation was neglected, resulting in migraines and exhaustion. By attending to his breathing and bodily sensations during therapy sessions, Beebe learned to access deeper empathic understanding and improved his own well-being. This example illustrates how bodily awareness and symbolic dreams can reveal function imbalances and unconscious material, aiding psychological integration. In Jungian and post-Jungian psychology, much of the depth work begins when the ego encounters its own internal contradictions. The shadow. In Beebe's 8-function model, while the first 4 functions represent ego syntonic consciousness, those aligned with the ego's values, the remaining 4 are considered ego dystonic. They represent the disowned rejected, or unconscious aspects of the self. These are not simply bad parts of ourselves, but are instead misunderstood, repressed, or misused energies that, when brought into awareness, can serve as vital paths to integration. The opposing personality, the shadow of the hero. The opposing personality shadows the dominant function, or the hero-heroine archetype. It typically manifests when a person's dominant function is being challenged, either by external situations or by inattention. Its role is antagonistic, often surfacing as defensiveness, irritability, sarcasm, or passive-aggressive behaviors. This archetype is not inherently malevolent. Rather, it emerges when the ego feels under siege. For instance, imagine an individual whose dominant function is introverted thinking, TI. When this person is confronted with emotionally charged, illogical situations, they may become rigid, dismissive, or coldly analytical. But beneath this stance often lies an unacknowledged fear, the fear of emotional chaos disrupting their internal clarity. The opposing personality reacts to this fear by defensively weaponizing logic, attempting to reassert control through detachment and superiority. Beebe notes that this opposing voice can carry a feminized energy in men, surfacing in moments of sarcastic dismissal or manipulative control. In relationships, it can manifest as projection, seeing others as rigid, controlling, or irrational, while unconsciously projecting one's own disowned attitudes onto them. Projection, Jung taught, is a way the unconscious communicates its unintegrated content. Until we claim our opposing personality, we are likely to see it in the difficult people around us, those who trigger our frustration, fear, or contempt. Recognizing this projection is the first step toward integration. In therapy, bringing awareness to the opposing personality often leads to important breakthroughs. A client might discover that the person they vilified most closely mirrors a repressed function within their own psyche. This realization can dissolve chronic interpersonal conflict and open the door to deeper self-acceptance. The senex, witch, the shadow of the parent, where the parent auxiliary function nurtures and protects, the senex or witch, its shadow counterpart, criticizes, controls, and inhibits. The senex, Latin for old man archetype, typically shadows the masculine auxiliary function, while the witch shadows the feminine. However, both archetypes function similarly. They express the authoritarian, judgmental aspects of the psyche that stifle spontaneity and growth. The senex is not evil. It can embody wisdom, structure, and ethical boundaries. But when unconscious or inflated, it becomes punitive. It's the internalized voice that says, "You'll never be good enough," "Don't be foolish," or "Grow up." In women, the witch may appear as a critical, shaming inner figure that cuts off emotion, imagination, or play. These archetypes often develop from early experiences with overly critical or absent caregivers. A person raised under the harsh gaze of a perfectionistic parent may internalize the senex energy, later turning it inward as self-reproach or outward as cynicism. In extreme cases, this becomes the voice of depression, the cold, grey lens through which life appears meaningless. One of Beebe's patients, a woman in her 40s, experienced profound creative paralysis. Though intellectually gifted and deeply intuitive, she struggled with an inner critic that constantly belittled her artistic work. In therapy, she came to recognize this voice as the witch archetype, a psychic internalization of her emotionally distant mother. Only by confronting and dialoguing with this inner figure Could she reclaim her creative vitality? The Sanax and witch can also appear in interpersonal relationships. A father who unconsciously identifies with the Sanax may stifle his children's autonomy, enforcing rigid rules for their own good. A partner possessed by the witch may belittle or emotionally control, believing they're simply offering honest feedback. The healing path begins by separating the wisdom within the Sanax witch from its shadow form. The patient is encouraged to ask, what value or virtue is this harsh voice trying to protect? In doing so, the authoritarian stance can soften, making room for compassion and discernment rather than judgment and shame. The trickster, the shadow of the eternal child. The trickster is one of the most fascinating and paradoxical archetypes in Beebe's model. As the shadow of the eternal child, the tertiary function, the trickster resists convention, subverts expectations, and delights in exposing hypocrisy. But it can also create psychological traps, known as double binds, where any choice seems wrong. The trickster often manifests as chaos disguised as cleverness. For example, a person whose tertiary function is introverted intuition may be drawn toward philosophical insight, but may also fall prey to distorted logic or spiritual bypassing. When the trickster seizes this function, they may manipulate truth to serve their ego or evade emotional accountability through abstract reasoning. Beebe observed that patients strongly influenced by the trickster can be difficult to work with in therapy. Their subjectivity is intense, their stories convoluted, and their resistance to vulnerability profound. They may charm, seduce, evade, or deceive, not out of malice, but as a defense mechanism developed from a life spent navigating confusing emotional terrain. One man Beebe worked with was notorious for shifting his narrative in every session. He would claim emotional breakthroughs only to later contradict them, undermining his own progress. Eventually it became clear that his trickster archetype was protecting him from a profound fear of betrayal. As a child, his caretakers had been inconsistent and unreliable, leading him to believe that sincerity would only invite abandonment. Integrating the trickster requires the therapist to recognize its games without shaming the patient. It involves turning the trickster's duplicity into a tool for insight, helping the patient to observe how they twist narratives or create no-win scenarios in relationships. Paradoxically, the trickster can become a guide to wholeness when its mischief is brought into consciousness. The demonic personality, the shadow of the anima. Ani. Finally, the most disturbing and potentially redemptive shadow function, the demonic personality. It shadows the inferior function, anima, animus, and often emerges when the ego is deeply threatened or fragmented. Its expression is intense, primal, and deeply personal. The demonic personality may sabotage relationships, destroy projects, or turn inward in the form of self-hatred and despair. This function emerges not from evil, but from pain. It represents the part of us that has been so wounded, so alienated, that it lashes out, not to harm others, but to be seen. In Beebe's own experience, the demonic archetype appeared during periods of exhaustion, depression, and internal collapse. He recalls a vivid dream of a Chinese laundress whose husband had squandered everything, leaving her alone. This woman symbolized his neglected, introverted sensation, the part of himself tied to bodily awareness, grounded reality, and self-care. In his excitement about engaging his patients' narratives, driven by extroverted intuition, he had ignored his physical needs. The demonic function, through dreams and symptoms, forced him to reckon with his own imbalance. Beebe writes that it was only through attending to these neglected signals, breathing properly, noticing bodily tension, respecting fatigue, that he could re-establish inner equilibrium. The demonic personality, once recognized, became a guide rather than an enemy. In therapy, the demonic personality often surfaces in patients as destructive internal voices. One patient, a man in his 50s, would feel physically agitated after phone calls with his abusive father. Though unaware of the connection at first, his wife sensed it immediately. Over time, the man learned to set boundaries, reclaim agency, and identify the demonic voice within that kept whispering, "You're nothing." Only by confronting this voice, dialoguing with it, and exploring its origins could he integrate its energy. This ultimately led to a career change aligned with his deeper values. A decision that might not have been possible without the destabilizing crisis triggered by the demonic personality. Embracing the shadow, the dance of integration. Each of these shadow archetypes challenges the ego's comfort zone. They disturb, provoke, and undermine, but they also offer truth. The Senex forces us to confront our rigidity. The trickster reveals where we deceive ourselves. The demonic personality uncovers where we hurt most and where we have the most to grow. Beebe's model does not demonize the shadow. Instead, it suggests that true individuation, becoming a whole person, requires us to welcome these darker aspects as inner companions, not to be ruled by them, but to listen to them, to ask, what pain are you carrying? What truth do you bear? What transformation do you offer? The journey to selfhood is not a straight ascent. It moves in spirals, down into the underworld of the psyche before rising again. To become truly human, we must meet the figures within who are not always heroic, kind, or wise. We must also meet the trickster, the witch, the opponent, the demon, and we have explored the landscape of the psyche through Beebe's 8-function model, moving from the conscious ego's strengths to its most shadowed vulnerabilities. Now we arrive at the most essential psychological and spiritual task of all: integration. At the heart of Jungian psychology lies the process of individuation, the ongoing journey toward becoming a whole person. It is not merely self-actualization in the modern sense, but a deep, often painful unfolding of the true self through conscious engagement with the unconscious. From functions to a self. Each function in the eightfold model, whether light or shadow, has a voice, a desire, and a potential to contribute to the larger system we call the self. The conscious functions provide orientation and agency. The shadow functions bring awareness of what lies outside our control, our preferences, and even our moral self-image. As Beebe emphasizes, these 8 archetypal roles are not abstract theory. They manifest every day in the way we think, feel, relate, struggle, and grow. In fact, these functions animate our inner drama, like actors in a play. They are personalities within our personality. To know them is not to categorize, but to converse, to learn their rhythms and their language, and to mediate the tensions between them. The psyche, in this view, is not a battlefield between good and evil, but a living ecosystem. And wholeness is achieved, not by eliminating certain functions, but by finding a place for all of them at the table, the axis of the self, vertical integration. At the center of Beebe's model lies what he calls the spine of personality. A vertical axis formed between the dominant, hero, and inferior, anima, animus, functions. This axis defines our core orientation to the self. It is the line between our strongest conscious identity and our deepest unconscious vulnerability. The hero leads, but often with pride, over-identification or illusion of mastery. The animus, in contrast, is often rejected, infantilized, or idealized, but it holds the key to renewal, inspiration, and the capacity to feel truly alive. The tension between the two is a psychological crucible. It burns away illusions and reveals the soul. For example, a man whose dominant function is introverted thinking may pride himself on logical clarity, mastery, and control. But beneath this lies an inferior extroverted feeling, the anima, the part of him concerned with human connection, harmony, and emotional resonance. If ignored, this function may show up through depression, frustration in relationships, or even psychosomatic illness. Only by building a bridge between these two poles, honoring both the competent mind and the sensitive soul, can he begin to feel whole. This bridging often occurs through dreams, symptoms, projection, or therapy. It is not a linear process, but a spiral, one that requires humility, courage, and self-examination. The arms of personality. Horizontal integration. Alongside the vertical spine lies the horizontal axis, the arms of personality. This includes the auxiliary, parent, and tertiary, eternal child functions. Together, they shape how we care for others and how we receive care. This axis speaks to our relational world, how we love, mentor, support, and play. Many people live their lives mostly within this horizontal dimension, defining themselves by their roles as parents, helpers, or creative souls. But if the vertical dimension is ignored, they may never ask, who am I beneath the roles I play? For example, someone who is a brilliant nurturer, auxiliary extroverted feeling, may pour their life into helping others, yet feel hollow when alone. Their eternal child, tertiary introverted intuition, may crave imaginative solitude, deep spiritual reflection, or symbolic meaning, but it has never been given a voice. The person gives endlessly, but never listens inward. Integration begins by noticing which axis dominates our lives. Are we overly identified with our strengths and terrified of our weaknesses? Do we use care for others to avoid caring for ourselves? Do we remain children in adult bodies, refusing to take responsibility? Or have we become harsh parents toward ourselves and others, losing joy, spontaneity, or vulnerability? Answering these questions requires both introspection and self-compassion. The goal is not balance in a superficial sense, but inner dialogue between all four quadrants: the heroic self, the wounded soul, the nurturing protector, and the creative child. The role of the shadow in transformation. While the conscious functions may lead us into adulthood, it is often the shadow functions that lead us into maturity. They force us to confront our blind spots, our compulsions, and our unhealed wounds. In doing so, they present us with choices: projection or ownership, defense or dialogue, fear or curiosity. Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The senex, trickster, opponent, and demonic personalities are not enemies to be slain, but teachers in disguise. They appear when we are under pressure, vulnerable, or undergoing major life transitions. A person who constantly blames others, projecting the opponent, may be unconsciously fighting against their own disowned power. A therapist who struggles with burnout may be overwhelmed by the witch, the shadow of the nurturing parent, whispering that their care is never enough. A creative artist blocked by perfectionism may be under the grip of the senex, unable to take risks for fear of judgment. In each case, the archetype asks us not for submission, but for honest conversation. What part of me is this? What does it need? How is it trying to protect me, even in misguided ways? When acknowledged, the shadow can transmute. The opponent becomes a boundary setter. The trickster becomes a creative rebel. The witch becomes a wise editor. The demonic personality becomes the daimon, the inner voice that demands truth, authenticity, and alignment. Dreams, symptoms, and the language of the unconscious Beebe, like Jung, placed great importance on dreams, not just as symbolic messages, but as living expressions of the psyche's voice. Often, a shadow function first emerges in dream imagery. A confusing figure, a frustrating scenario, or an unresolved conflict. What we resist in waking life becomes vivid in our sleep. Similarly, symptoms, emotional, physical, or relational, are often the body's way of expressing what the ego cannot. Anxiety, depression, tension, migraines. These are not merely disorders to be eliminated, but invitations to listen more deeply. In Beebe's case, his migraines were the body's alarm system, warning him that he had abandoned his introverted sensation, his connection to breath, body, and grounded awareness. Only by listening to that neglected function could he return to health. We might ask ourselves, what are my symptoms saying? What am I dreaming about again and again? Where is my shadow trying to speak? By translating emotion into image and image into awareness, we reduce the power of the unconscious to control us from behind the curtain. Instead, we bring those energies into the light. The self is not a fixed identity. Perhaps one of the most important insights of the 8-function model is this. You are not just your dominant function. You are a complex, dynamic system of energies, archetypes, stories, and possibilities. No function alone defines you. The same is true for others, no matter how frustrating or different they may seem. Integration is not about becoming perfect or balanced. It's about becoming whole, aware of all the parts, and in conscious relationship with them. As Jung once said, I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. This also means that individuation is never complete. It is a lifelong dialogue between the ego and the unconscious, the past and the future, the outer life and the inner world. Each time we suffer, struggle, or stumble, the psyche may be opening a new chapter in that dialogue. Final reflections, living the paradox. To be human is to live in paradox. We are capable of both wisdom and folly, care and cruelty, insight and blindness. Beebe's 8-function model does not eliminate this paradox. It embraces it. It offers a framework for understanding how our contradictions can be held, understood, and ultimately transformed. The hero must listen to the opponent. The parent must guide without controlling. The child must learn without avoiding. The anima must open the door to the soul. And in all of this, the demonic must be acknowledged, not worshipped, but respected as the voice of what's been lost, wounded, or ignored. Integration is not linear. It is a spiral path inward and outward, toward deeper empathy, clearer identity, and a richer relationship with both the self and others. So we return to the essential question, who am I becoming? And more importantly, am I listening to all the voices within me, even the ones I once